Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban al HaTorah. Obviously, this is the very beginning of the Torah and the beginning of our taste and our insights into the Ramban on the Torah. It's obviously impossible to start learning without acknowledging what Klal Yisrael, what Am Yisrael is going through right now, with the inhuman, or more precisely, I guess, subhuman behavior of our enemies. And our learning together should be a zchus for us, and help HaKadosh Baruch Hu see merit in us, and hopefully not make this go away, but grant us the decisive victory over evil that we deserve, and that would be Mekadesh Shem Shamayim Barabim. Okay, I'd like to do 3 Rambans today if we have the time. 2 of them, without explicitly discussing it, or maybe explicitly discussing it, 2 of them related to the current situation. And let's start with the first, and it's the very first Ramban on the Torah. I should point out the Ramban wrote an introduction to the Torah. He wrote an introduction to each sefer of the Torah. So there's an introduction to Shmos, and Vayikra, and Bamidbar, and Devarim. The introduction is not to Bereishit, it's an introduction to the entire Chamisha Chumshei Torah. It touches on a lot of fundamental questions, but it's not really an introduction to Bereishit, so we're not going to do it. But if people have time to do a special limud and to do the introduction to Ramban on the Torah, you'll be wildly rewarded by it. It's fantastic. Okay, but let's start at the beginning. Everybody knows the first Rashi in the Torah, and the Ramban knows it as well, and that's where we start. The first Rashi, Amar Rav Yitzchak, Lo hayat tzarich la'atchil Torah ela me'achodesh hazeh lachem, shehi mitzvah rishana shenitztavu ba Yisrael. Right, the Torah really only had to start in Parshas Bo with the first mitzvah in the Torah, Umatam pasach beBereishis, she'im yomru umot ha'olam listimatem shekivashtem lachem artzot shiva goyim. If the Gentiles say to us, you stole our land, heim omrim lahem kol haaretz shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu hi. We say, no, it's God's land. Unisana la'asher yashar beinav, and God can give it to whoever He wants. Birtzono nitala lahem, it's true. Originally He allowed you to live in it, He gave it to you. Ubirtzana nitala mehem, unitala lanu, and God willingly took the land away from you and gave it to us. So, it's comforting. It obviously never works to tell Goyim that God gave us the land, but it's a comforting idea, except the premise of the Medrash that Rashi is quoting, the premise is that the Torah exists for halacha, right? So if the Torah exists for halacha, it should start in Parshas Bo with HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim. But do we really agree with that? So the Ramban asks, and this is classic Ramban, almost every question that we have, the Ramban has. It's just simple this way. So says the Ramban, V'yesh li shol ba. V'yesh li shol, I often think in the Ramban is, it's such an obvious question. People in shul come over to me and ask me all the time, V'yesh li shol ba. Ki tzarich gadol hu lahatchil Torah beBereishit bara Elokim. What do you mean? There's a huge benefit to starting with Bereishit. Ki hu shoresh ha'emunah. V'she'eino ma'amin bezeh v'choshev sha'olam kadmon hu kofer bi'ikar. Ve'ein lo Torah klal. A person who thinks that the world pre-existed the Torah is a kofar. If he doesn't believe that God created the world, he's a kofar. So what do you mean there's no benefit to the beginning of the Torah? What do you mean there's no benefit to Sefer Bereishit? And the Ramban's only going to deal with the beginning of the Torah right now, but it applies to everything. How could that be? V'hatshuva, says the Ramban, there's an answer. Mipnei shema'aseh Bereishit sod amok Eino muvan min ha-mikraot. Says the Ramban, it's fascinating he would say this, says the Ramban, no one understands Parshas Bereishit. Right? Yes, it's written there, but who understands it? V'lo yivadal burav ela mipi ha-kabbalah ad Moshe Rabbeinu mipi ha-gvura. Yes, there are secrets of the Torah, but that's only available to people who have that Kabbalah from Moshe Rabbeinu. V'yoda'av chayvim lahastir, and people who understand Ma'aseh Bereishit, people who really understand Ma'aseh Bereishit, are not allowed to tell it to me and you. Lekach amar Rabbi Yitzchak she'ein lahatchalat HaTorah tzorech beBereishit bara That's what the Medrash means. The Medrash means, why does the Torah start with Bereishit since no one understands it anyway? And I mean it literally. Rav Amital Zatzal used to say about Parshas Bereishit, Ani lo yodea ma ze tohu, ani lo yodea ma ze vohu, ani lo mevin shum davar chutz midavar achad, v'zeh she'akadosh baruch hu bara et ha'olam. Okay, and that has to be our approach. We don't understand it. What does it mean that animals were created on the fifth day? None of it means anything to us. And especially since there's more than one description of the Bria, and some people think everything was created on the first day, and some people think, it was created twice, once b'midas hadin, once b'midas harachamim. Says the Ramban, so what's the help in a parsha that no one really understands? What's the difference? Do we really understand how Chava was created? Do we really think that God opened up Adam and made a woman out of it? Do we really think he was created with two sides? And then they sinned. Do we really understand why they would have eaten from the Eitz Hadas if it was the only mitzvah that God gave them? V'sipur ganedim v'gerush adam imenu ki kol ze lo yuvan bina shlema min haktuvim. We're not going to understand it from the psukim. V'chol shekein sipur dor hamabul v'haflaga, right? The dispersion of the people. She'ein hatzarach b'hem gadol. But there is a tzorach. So what's the real question? So says the Ramban, V'yaspik la'anshei HaTorah biladei haktuvim ha'ela. We would have believed it without the psukim. V'yaminu bichlal b'nizkar lahem ba'aser hadibrot. What's he referring to? Ki sheishet yamim asa Hashem et hashamayim ve'et haaretz et hayam ve'et kol hashabam v'yonach b'yom hashvi'i. Says the Ramban, if the Torah had just told us that pasuk, God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh day, we would be, in theory at least, exactly where we are now. Without all of the explanations, without all of the long psukim, we'd be exactly where we are now. Okay, God created the world. Okay, and some select people would understand more, would have received it orally from Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the question. And so the way the Ramban presents it, of course there's a value in creation. But since we don't understand it, why the explanations? And answer the Ramban as follows. V'natan Rabbi Yitzchak tam lazeh. What's the explanation of the Medrash? Ki hitchila HaTorah beBereishit bara Elokim v'sipur kol inyan hayitzira ad briat ha'adam v'him shilo b'maaseh yadav v'chol shat tachat raglav. Okay, v'gan Eden shehu mivchar mikamot ha'nivraim ba'olam hazeh. All the details, and Gan Eden, which we don't really understand, but it's clearly the most wonderful place in the world, Na'aseh machon l'shivto, and God's resting place. All these things are true, and all these things happen, ad shegiresh oto cheto misham, until Adam Harishon and Chava were forced to leave Gan Eden because of their sin. The Ramban is making a subtle point now. The first thing is, why do I need to know about Gan Eden? Well, I need to know that Adam and Chava were kicked out of Gan Eden because they sinned. Va'anshei dor hamabul b'chetam garshu min ha'olam. Right, we don't normally think of the destruction of the world the way the Ramban sees it, but he basically says it's a technicality. The people sinned, God had to get rid of them. But he had to get rid of them from the whole world, which of course yields their death. But the point is, they had to get rid of them. V'hat sadik bahem levado nimlat. Noach was saved, hu uvanav. V'zaram chatam, and then they sinned. Garam lahem lahafitzam b'mekamot ulezarotam ba'aratzot. And so they were caused to be dispersed amongst all the nations. They also had to be exiled. V'tafsu lahem ha'mekamot lemishpachotam b'goyehem. And so they lived in the places that they were exiled to. K'fi shenizdamein lahem, the way it worked out for them. Im kain, here's the point. Ra'uihu ka'asher yosif hagod lachato. The message of Parshas Bereishit, and I guess most of Parshas Noach, the Ramban is basically describing the need of the Torah for everything before Avram Avinu. He'll describe Avram Avinu when we get there. Ki kachu mishpat ha'elokim ba'aretz me'olam. That's how God deals with the land from time immemorial. V'chol shekein im ha'mesupar bekatuv ki Canaan mikulal v'nimkar le'eved olam. When the Torah goes out of its way to tell us a story in next week's parsha that Canaan was cursed by Noach, ve'eino ra'ui sheyirash mivchar mikomot ha'yishuv. Obviously, Canaan can't inherit Eretz Canaan. Eretz Canaan is Eretz Yisrael. He's a bad person. Can't be. Aval Yeshu Avdei Hashem Zera Ohavo. Says the Ramban, the purpose of Parshas Bereishit and Parshas Noach are not the details. The purpose of all the stories in Parshas Bereishit and Parshas Noach is to teach us one rule. The rule is what we refer to as schar va'onesh. The rule is, if you worship God, you can stay where you are, you can be rewarded. If you sin, you're going to be exiled. And so the Ramban agrees with Rashi. The Medrash is correct. Kach ma'asav yigid la'amo latet lahem nachalat goyim she'im yomru imot ha'olam listim atem nomru lahem kol ha'olam shel HaKadosh Baruch hu nitana lachem v'hu lakach mikem unitana lanu. People who sin do not merit the land of Israel. People who sin do not merit the chosen land. We, and obviously in current events, God is telling us we have to be better. Each of us, not the other person, but each of us. But what's clear is that the subhumans have no claim to Eretz Yisrael. They had a claim. God gave it to them originally. And then thousands of years ago already, they sinned. And God took it away from them and gave it to us. God took it away from them because they're sinners, and He gave it to us because we're Ovdei Hashem. And obviously, we need to be better Ovdei Hashem, but that's the first message of the Ramban. The first message of the Ramban is that the first Rashi in the Torah is correct, but it's not to be understood the way we understood it as some kind of, general statement. The first Rashi means, it's true, no one understands Sefer Bereishit. No one really understands Parshas Bereishit. No one really understands Parshas Noach. But the message of the not understanding is one thing that is clear. If you're bad, God exiles you. And if God exiles you, you're out, and Klal Yisrael gets it. Okay? That's the first Ramban I wanted to do with you. A second one, unrelated. I mean, there's so many Rambans in Bereishit, we could do this for hours and hours. But it's fascinating. At the end of the first parak of Bereishit, the Torah tells us an interesting story. Vayivarech el otam Elokim vayomer lahem Elokim peru urvu umilu et haaretz v'chivshua. Right, basically take dominion over the land. Uridu bidgat hayam uv'of hashamayim v'chol chayil romeset al haaretz. Continues the Torah. Vayomer Elokim hinei natati lachem et kol esev zorea zera asher al pnei kol haaretz ve'et kol ha'etz asher bo pri'etz zorea zara lachem yihiyeh la'achla. Right? What can man eat? Man can eat vegetation. Man can eat fruits and vegetables. Man can be a vegetarian. What can't man eat? Apparently he can't eat meat. Ulechol chayat haaretz ulechol of hashmam ulechol romeis al haaretz asher bo nefesh chaya et kol yerek esev la'achla vayhi chen. Okay, there's no prohibition on killing animals, but there's no permission for killing animals. Says the Ramban. V'hinei natati lachem et kol esev zorea zera lo hirsha la'adam u'l'hishto lahamit beryav le'echol basar. Says the Ramban, and I have to admit it, even though I love eating meat, the Ramban here in Bereishit does seem to speak highly of people who refrain from eating meat. Adam and Chava were not permitted to eat meat. Ach kol yerek esev yochlu yachdav kulam. They can eat vegetation. Ukishaba'u b'nei Noach hitir lahem basar. But obviously, when Bnei Noach came after the Mabul, God permitted them to eat meat. Shenemar kol remes asher uchay lachem yeh lachla ki yerek esev nasat lachem et kol ki yerek esev shehitarti la'adam harishon hitarti lachem et kol. Okay, that's a Rashi. The Ramban agrees with the general idea. It's a beferish pasuk in the Torah that after the Mabul, God says to us, now you can hunt animals and eat them, but not before. And he says, okay, that's the correct pshat. Now, there's a technical point the Ramban wants to address. Did human beings and animals eat the same exact thing, or was there a difference between them? So he says, Ulechol chayat haaretz lachem v'lachayot natati ha'asavim ve'et ha'ilanot ve'et kol yerek esev la'achla. Okay, I gave them vegetation. There's a machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban whether animals and human beings ate the same things. The Ramban thinks no, animals were not allowed to eat fruit. Animals just ate vegetation, and we were allowed to eat fruit. But either way, the sense you get is that in the Bria, in the original plan, there was more of a continuum than there is now. Meaning, there's minerals, and then there's vegetation, and then there's animals, and there's human beings, in certain way, like a continuum. Yes, man is better than animals, but since they share so much, man is not allowed to kill animals. So the question is, what changed after the Mabul that allowed God to tell us, now we're allowed to eat animals? So I skipped a few lines, and here goes. Achabasar lo hurshu bo ad b'nei Noach kidat rabotenu fu pshuto shel mikra. Right? Meat wasn't permitted to human beings until after the Mabul. Now why? So he says, V'hayazeh mipnei sheba'alei nefesh hatnua yesh lam kitzat ma'ala benafsham. Animals, he said, have some redeeming qualities, I would say. They have some character traits that remind them of human beings. Nidmuba liba'alei hanefesh hamaskelet. They appear in certain ways to be similar to us, people who have intelligence. In what ways? So says the Ramban, V'yesh lahem b'chira b'tovatam u'muzonotehem, right? They can choose certain things, right? Animals can like certain foods and not like other foods. V'yivruchu min hatzar v'hamita. Obviously, animals have an instinct to live, right? They have an instinct for danger that they run away from. V'hakatuv omer, mi yodea ruach b'nei ha'adam ha'olehi l'mala v'ruach ha'beima ha'yiredeti l'mata la'aretz. Sometimes humans and animals, says the pasuk in Kohelet, you can't tell the difference. Sometimes. V'ka'asher chatu v'hishchit kol basar et darko al haaretz. When humanity sinned and animals sinned as well, right? The Torah tells us it's not just human beings who sinned, animals also became sexually deviant before the Mabul. V'nigzar sheyamutu b'mabul. Right? They were supposed to all die. Uba'avur Noach hitzil mehem likiyum hamin. This, I think, is the key point. Says the Ramban, animals were not saved because they merited being saved. Animals were saved because the world needs animals, because Noach needed animals, because he needs donkeys and he needs sheep and he needs all the animals to work with and to create a new world with. But they were saved only in the zchus of Noach. Natan lahem reshut lishchot v'le'echol ki kiyumam ba'avuro. Because they were saved through the merit of Noach, God allowed Noach and his children, us, to kill animals and to eat them. And the way I see it is, there's like a tectonic shift. When the world was created, there was more of a continuum. And human beings and animals lived together, and the Ramban says in other places, lions didn't exercise self-restraint in not eating human beings back then. It wasn't part of their nature. Animals had no instinct to kill human beings. We lived together, kind of the way v'gar ze'ev im keves v'namev yirbatz, right? The way it's supposed to be in Yemos HaMashiach. The original world was people lived in peace. There was no instinct to kill each other. But then, after the Mabul, there became this shift, and human beings became higher on the food chain, and animals became lower. And the gap between human beings who have a nefesh maskelet, and we can speak and we can communicate and we can think, became greater. And at that point, God said, okay, you can kill animals. Ve'im kol zeh, nevertheless, lo natan hareshut b'nefesh. He didn't allow us to kill the nefesh of an animal. V'asar lohem eiver min achai. and we're prohibited from eating a bone from a living animal. V'osif lanu b'mitzvot le'esor kol dam mipnei ma'amad lenefesh. The reason why we can eat meat, but we can't eat blood, is because blood represents the nefesh of an animal. And that, despite the heter of us to eat meat, remains prohibited. Ki dirsiv, ki nefesh kol basar damo benafshohu, va'omar livnei Yisrael dam kol basar lo tochelu, ki nefesh kol basar damohu, etc. So says the Ramban, on the one hand, the heter to eat meat was a concession. But on the other hand, it was reflective of the new world. And in the new world, what had been a small gap between animals and human beings became a much larger gap. For some reason, we're promoted. For some reason, they're demoted. And because of that gap, God allows us to kill animals. Now, he allows us, but in a certain way. What happens now? V'zet ta'am hashchita, says the Ramban. That's why we have to shecht animals. God didn't give us permission to torture animals, right? The torturing of animals continues to be prohibited. Tsar ba'alei chaim, despite there's no pasuk that says it, is asur min HaTorah, says the Gemara. V'zo birchatenu, says the Ramban. That's why we make a bracha. It's strange. What's the bracha? Shem v'reich asher kiddushanu b'tzasav v'tzivanu al hashchita. What does the bracha mean? So there's many possibilities to what it means. The Abu Hav, in the footnotes of the Shevel edition says as follows: Mipnei shitzar ba'alei chayim min HaTorah v'lachein tzarich l'shaer shelo litzara, because we're prohibited from torturing or causing unnecessary pain to animals. B'chol ma she'efshar v'zoi shchita min hatzavar. The reason we make a bracha on shchita is not because God wants us to shecht every animal in the world. It's because God said, if you're going to shecht animals, be sensitive to their pain, and the process of shchita is the most painless way to kill animals. And so God turned what would have been a human instinct, an uncontrollable human instinct, to just kill animals, into a mitzvah HaTorah. Again, not a mitzvah chiyuvit. If a cow walks past me and I don't slaughter it, I'm not in violation of any mitzvah HaTorah. But if I do it with the restrictions that God provided to me. I make a bracha asher kisham sav sivanu ala shchita, and I do it in a way that causes the least amount of pain to the animal. Okay, that's the second Ramban. The third one is back to current events in a subtle way, but it'll become clear in a second. Says the Torah, if I could find it quickly. Says the Torah in Perek Vav. Vayiru b'nei ha'elokim et benot ha'adam ki tovot heina, vayikchu lahem nashim mikol asher bacharu. Right, this is the beginning of the story of the Mabul. This is the beginning of the story of the downfall of human beings. And Vayomer Hashem lo yodan uchi ba'adam lo olam b'shagam hu basar. Okay, vayu yamav me'av esrim shana. God's going to give us another 120 years. The Ramban sees something interesting here. Ki tovot heina. What's going on? So I'll skip a little bit, and he says, Visiper, okay, now I'll have to read it. Kimo ki tirech hamor sonacha, ki tovot heina means it's a recognition of something. Like you see your friend's, your enemy's donkey, ki kareg kansi por lefanecha. Kasher hine tovot, yikchu otan lahem linnashim ba'ones. Because man saw that women were good, they took them against their will, and they raped them. V'siper hakatuv hechamas. And the Torah teaches us the chamas that they did. What does the word chamas mean? So in this context, it means some kind of injustice. It's wrong to take women against their will. V'amar od, mikol asher bacharu, la'achnis hanisuot la'achirim, that they would take even married women. Now the Ramban points something out here, fascinating. Aval lo hizkira katuv ha'isur bahem b'feirush. Okay, but what's the isur? How do human beings know that rape is prohibited? How do human beings know that taking a person's wife is prohibited? Says the Ramban, V'lo nigzar aleihem ha'onesh rak al ha'chamas. God is going to punish humanity not because they were sexually immoral, but because of the Hamas, because of the injustice, because of the lack of ethics, because it's obvious. Yes, they're Isurei Torah, and we take them seriously, and we do everything we can to avoid them and to uphold them. But there's something else, hints the Ramban. It's ethics. It's acting like a human being. And God is more offended by the inability of humans to act like human beings than he is by a violation of the halacha. Lefi shehu inyan muskal einenu tzarich leTorah. Says the Ramban, our instincts, the thing that tells us that it's wrong to rape, the thing that tells us that it's wrong to behead children, it's not a halacha. It's human ethics. It's right and wrong. And when a person violates that, says the Ramban, God gets angrier. That's a much worse behavior. And obviously, the word Hamas, represents, I don't know why terrorist organization would choose such an evil word, other than the fact that they're evil. And that's the point the Ramban makes. And it's amplified, we can get a head start on next week, it's amplified in Parshas Noach. The Torah says, Perek Vav Halacha Yud Gimel, Vayomer Elokim leNoach, Kates kal basar ba lefanai, ki mala'a haaretz Hamas mipneihem, v'hini mashchitam et haaretz. So there the Ramban is even clearer. What does it mean, Hamas? So he says, Hu hagezel v'ha'oshek. Right? It's some kind of theft and immorality. V'natan leNoach hatam b'Hamas. Why is the Torah telling us the reason that God's going to destroy the world is because of Hamas? V'lo yizkir hashchatata haderech. Right? Human beings were bad. Why doesn't the Torah just say that? Says the Ramban, Ki ha-Hamas hu ha-chet ha-yadua v'ha-mefursam. Because Hamas represents, the worst thing possible, the immorality of human beings. V'rabotenu amru, she'alav nitchatem gizar dinam, v'hatam mipnei shehu mitzvah muskelet. Because it's obvious. Ein lahem bat tzorech l'navi lahazhir. V'od shu ra l'shamayim v'labriot. Meaning, I don't need a prophet to tell me that it's wrong to rape. I don't need a prophet to tell me that it's wrong to behead children. I don't need a prophet to tell me that it's wrong to massacre and to do all the things that Hamas does. It's obvious. And the Torah is more sensitive to the obvious things, to morality, to ethics, to how we should treat each other. The Torah is much more sensitive to that than even to halachos of the Torah. And therefore, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm going to destroy the world, ki malah haaretz Hamas mipneihem. Because Hamas is the reigning ethic of the world, and that's not acceptable. Okay, Yashkoach, let's stop here. We basically saw the first Ramban on the Torah, which was fascinating, and the Ramban telling us that the story of God, the story of exile and reward, is what we're supposed to learn from Bereishit and from a little bit of Noach, because otherwise we're not going to understand anything. We saw also the discussion of why meat became mutter to us, right? Originally, man and animals were closer to each other. After the Mabul, the gap became bigger, and man was allowed to kill and to eat animals within the rules of Tsar Baalei Chaim, doing it in a way that doesn't pain them. And finally, we saw the beginning of the story of the Mabul at the end of this week's parasha and the beginning of next week's parasha, which God is going to destroy the world because of Hamas. Hamas, represents the inhumanity of human beings. And if human beings can't be inhuman, God destroys them. And thank God we are human. We'll continue to be human. We'll continue to be more human. And God should bring peace to us and rachamim on us and all of Klal Yisrael. Shabbat shalom to all.